So today I have a topic that I don't suggest that you bring up at your next business dinner. And I embarked on this topic after having seen a reference to a book that I thought, well, this one should be a fun read, as well as a great opportunity for my first YouTube clickbait. Ultimately, I think we'll categorize it as Who Could Resist? Much to my surprise, the book was more than just serious. It was, in fact, a damned weighty tome. So to properly deal with the ideas raised, I'm going to have to split this video into two. So this topic is a serious consideration of the question, are the relationships between bosses and employees sadomasochistic? A quick off-the-cuff answer would be that, at least in the era of Me Too, sure, sometimes. Maybe a dive into the details of Harvey Weinstein's worst behavior. Or from my home country of Canada, broadcaster Jian Ghomeshi, who was charged with 4 counts of sexual assault and one very specific count of overcoming resistance by choking. But in fact, the topic is much broader than just certain unhealthy workplaces and the predators who prowl them. No, in fact, the book I'm referring to tries to find sadomasochistic behavior in the average workplace. This is XCG, and welcome to the 4th episode of Pernicious Chattel. Came across a reference to a book written by Lynn S recently, and knew immediately that I had to know more. I mean, how could any self-respecting social critic not read a book titled Sadomasochism in Everyday Life, The Dynamics of Power and Powerlessness? As I've said, the book wasn't some light reading, but a deadly serious, well-argued, and somewhat overly complex academic text. It was compelling enough that I have read most of it over the period of just a few days. The book leans heavily on feminist and Marxist thought, and I know, there are many who would immediately dismiss it on that basis alone. But to be honest, it fit well enough with my experience that I think it makes a number of really good, really insightful observations about how human beings relate to one another in a hierarchy, like a bureaucracy or a business. Besides, it's much more fun to compare office politics to S&M rather than using some math-laden and just as sketchy theory like economics. Chancellor's observations rest on her clear definition of what sadomasochism is. She is not talking explicitly about sexual behavior. Popular usage of the term sadomasochism usually has a sexual element. Her argument is that the dynamics of sadism and masochism are primarily a style of interaction that has to do with satisfying emotional needs through an exchange of power. The sadist finds satisfaction out of dominating and forcing his or her will onto the masochist, and the masochist finds satisfaction through submitting. Chancellor defines sadomasochism as follows, quote, "The sadomasochistic dynamic referred to here is a very particular but common social relationship based on power and powerlessness, dominance and subordination. That, by definition, would have to conform to all of the 4 interrelating criteria. An excessive attachment exists for both parties, that neither feels as though the other can be done without. Dependence is of a symbiotic character in that both feel a compulsive need for physical, but most critically, for psychic connection. Second, interaction has a repetitive and ritualistic character in that the sadist is consistently drawn toward a position of control, while the masochist is just as consistently in the persona of the more controlled. The third criteria is a regularized character, but also constantly changing, as the actions of the sadist bring about the reactions on the part of the masochist, and vice versa. The most central criterion of the sadomasochistic dynamic is whether individuals or groups positioned masochistically face severe consequences should they question, talk about, or challenge the power of those individuals or groups who are structurally more powerful. Chancer then further defines a sadist and a masochist as having a set of characteristics that apply to their behavior. The establishment of a hierarchical division between the self and the other that rests on the attribution of superiority to the sadist and of inferiority to the masochist. The sadist is only satisfied if the masochist appears to put up some resistance to be overcome. The masochist is only satisfied if the sadist takes all responsibility for running the game and making it satisfying. A process that requires the sadist to work, sometimes irrationally, at constant innovation, and requires the masochist to sometimes place unwittingly hostile demands on the sadist to be sadistic. These set of needs drives a type of interaction that is surprisingly complicated and interwoven. The masochist they're offering up their submission because they don't want to take responsibility and want to feel safe. But because they can easily admit that they are needy, they're actually relatively stable and independent. Masochists have less of an illusion because they knowingly give up their control in exchange for clarity and security. In this, they make a somewhat rational decision. If the masochist is unhappy for any reason, they can comfortably blame that on the failures of their sadist. Their submission might be unpleasant in itself, but it isn't risky because they aren't as responsible for the success or failure of the enterprise. For instance, if the person suffers from shame or excessive guilt, when they give up their power to another person, they abdicate responsibility and have nothing to feel bad about. The sadist, on the other hand, makes no admission in taking up their role. They take control because they seek the pleasure of exercising control over another. But this power is somewhat of an illusion. The sadist is, in fact, bound and dependent on the masochist. The sadist needs the masochist to submit in order to feel powerful. But if the masochist were to simply submit without maintaining some resistance, then this power becomes a bit meaningless. To clarify this tendency, consider this unrelated illustration. A general leads his army to win a hard battle. Then he might feel very good about the victory because of the challenge, his success by overcoming. But the same emotional gratification wouldn't come from stepping on an ant. Any schmuck could step on an ant. In other words, the masochist admits that they are a needy human, and whether the relationship works or doesn't, they remain a needy human. Whereas the sadist, without someone to exercise power over, loses any claim to their superiority, and as a result, they also lose their identity. The psychology of the sadist has another hidden weakness. The sadist often seeks the recognition of an independent and respected external party to confirm that they are successful and to be admired. Chancer says, quote, "I see narcissism as itself symptomatic of a culture of sadomasochism and of obsessive concern about the opinions of others." Close quote. Because the masochist seeks the positive regard of the sadist, the relationship can be satisfying. But the sadist, at least in the long run, can't benefit from the positive regard of the masochist. After all, the masochist is by definition inferior. The sadist has vulnerability and weakness that, by definition, can never be fully satisfied within the relationship itself. Any satisfaction is short-term once he or she has proven superiority. Then it becomes clear that the masochist is simply weak and their submission is no longer a validation of the sadist's power. Therefore, the sadist needs to look elsewhere for validation and recognition. Chancer's definition of a sadomasochistic relationship is far more contradictory and complex than the popular conception. The masochist holds much more power than is obvious, and the sadist is much more dependent than they first appear. They are both trapped in an interdependent dance where the sadist must continue and innovate to keep the relationship worthwhile. Otherwise lose both the satisfaction of power and the potential for esteem from external parties. The masochist benefits through the abdication of responsibility and a straightforward pursuit of realistic goals. Once these definitions are clarified, Chancellor goes on to analyze how they might apply to the modern workplace. In the case of the first requirement, that there needs to be hierarchy and a clear superior and inferior position, modern work fits the bill. It is a social symbiosis. It has been created by the structure of capitalism, making human survival conditional upon laboring, then proceeding to make labor available only conditionally, never guaranteed and secure. So that, finally, survival itself becomes conditional and bathed in uncertainty. The rich and successful are able to hire people and make them do what they want because people without access to those resources have no choice if they want to survive and have a materially pleasant life. We generally accept that captains of industry, successful businessmen, etc., have more power and are implicitly superior, at least in the world of business. We often blindly accept their authority and give them the right to set the conditions of our work. We follow them on Twitter and use them as examples of success. Hierarchy is both implicit and explicit. People will then seek to attach themselves to these successful individuals by applying to work for them. The second requirement of a sadomasochistic relationship is a ritual nature. This is also met. The sadist/employer, the masochist/employee are drawn in more and more as the relationship develops. Chancellor writes, quote, "This type of stratification plays a role in facilitating bureaucratic control because it internally divides the workplace and reinforces this division in terms of supposedly objective laws." I would translate this explanation into social psychological terminology by claiming that the deeper effectiveness of bureaucratic control is to tie the worker into an indefinitely regressing sadomasochistic structure. Stated more plainly, there are policies and procedures in most workplaces, and these take on a ritual nature where obedience is demanded from the employee and vigilance or enforcement is demanded from the employer. In the case of criteria number 3, the modern workplace satisfies just as easily. The sadomasochistic relationship will not only be regulated and defined, but that it also needs to innovate and evolve. For the employer/sadist, there is a need to innovate and grow the business, and therefore continually increase demands on the worker/masochist. We accept this is necessary for competition, but Chancellor argues that the goal isn't only wealth, but also to earn the recognition of others. Business owners, CEOs, etc., often become independently wealthy, yet continue to work towards never-ending growth. Modern economics implies that there is no coercion in the free market, yet it does seem a bit sanguine to explain the ever-expanding work hours, accompanying stress, anxiety, depression, without also some coercion working on all participants. Similar to the sadist, the employer must remain unaware of their dependent and enmeshed relationship with employees. Quote, "For the capitalist who seeks limitless power, no such acknowledgement is possible. To the extent he or she pursues a goal of limitless power, the modern capitalist cannot acknowledge that as a human being, he or she is not only independent, but dependent as well. As with the classic sadomasochistic relationship, the sadist/employer can't achieve power without someone else to have power over. You can't have an employer without an employee. And you can't have success without having employees produce what you want, how you want it. But rarely, when speaking of successful businessmen, do we ever discuss that they literally owe their success to the labors of others. For instance, we spend a great deal of time talking about the successes of Elon Musk, but rarely do we speak about the legion of engineers, scientists, financiers, managers, and run-of-the-mill workers who actually bring his ideas to life. While Elon Musk may be a visionary and a good leader, he does not have the technical skills or the time necessary to build even a single Tesla. It is implied everywhere that senior executives or owners of businesses single-handedly deserve the credit for the successes of their company, And yet, obviously, that isn't the truth. There is almost inevitably an army of competent, hardworking, and highly talented people without whom the executive would deliver nothing and remain unknown. The employee-employer relationship has the same complicated push-pull that so characterizes the S&M relationship. Dependence and tension runs both ways. There is constant pressure on the employer to attract employees, requiring that the employer be successful and provide a workplace that is attractive. The employee, on the other hand, is motivated to make themselves attractive versus other employees, while at the same time satisfying the needs of their employer. So, the ideal would be someone both independent and clearly cognizant that ultimate authority rests with the more powerful, superior, who is both bold and knows when boldness is about to exceed the limits of tolerability, who is clever at remaining within the boundaries of this seemingly contradictory yet coexisting parameter. In a how-to book on employment entitled Survival in the Office, Andrew Durbin urges the company up-and-coming subordinate to help the boss succeed, to remember that the boss has problems also, to discover the boss's objective, and to display loyalty rather than disloyalty. But just a few pages later, Durbin goes on to say that if the employee wishes to get a promotion, to stay on the move, more than loyalty is required. One must take initiatives. The boss may wish some degree of disapproval to be forthcoming, ends by reasserting power, only to wish for yet another challenge, on and on into the indefinite future. This syndrome may also explain the capitalist's constant innovation and search for new tasks, new research, new markets for investment. Like a child who is forever testing, the capitalist, like the sadist, weaves back and forth between the desires for challenges to his or her power and the frightening need to squelch them. On the flip side, the worker/masochist will feel subordinate endlessly because, quote, a strong sense of power and self-actualization can only emerge with its own exercise. Psychologically speaking, a sense of simultaneous dependence and independence develops when a child can strike out on its own without fear of losing connections to others in the human community. If the child is not able to strike out on its own, however, chances are it will feel negatively towards the self, which has been forced to remain in a situation of excessive dependency, end quote. These tendencies have become more psychologically pernicious as our economy has continually shifted more and more to be service-based. So now, rather than only being submissive in our labor and interactions with our employer, we are often tasked with satisfying a customer or a client, leaving them feeling positive emotion as a result of our work. Thereby, we are not only selling our labor, but suppressing our own emotional states and performing emotional labor. Quote, it is as if though jobs based on emotional labor are not content to control body and mind, but insist on reaching out to grab the soul as well. The masochist/employee seems to also allow for and expect to suffer as a result of their work. Implicit in cultural beliefs about work is that work should be demanding and to some extent unpleasant. The ideal is not to find a free and easy workplace so much as a workplace where there are potentially harsh requirements, but the employee is noticed and given praise, as well as other recognition when they rise to the possibly crushing demands placed on them. Many employees will express satisfaction with a difficult job and a hard-to-please boss, as long as they feel valued by their employer. Not unlike a masochist, employees often feel pride in satisfying their boss's sadistic demands. Of course, there is the final criteria, that is, the masochist/employees cannot question the authority of the sadist/employer. Chancer is quite confident on this topic. Quote, like the repercussions meted out by the sadist, capitalism threatens to make one pay for rebellion by throwing the rebel out into the cold. Questioning the rules and regulations of the workplace is often difficult or impossible, for challenging the boss's authority may be tantamount to committing job suicide. The person who works may thus commonly feel, or be asked to feel, a socially generated obsession with whether or not she or he is acceptably pleasing to others. whether or not to her or himself, end quote. So there you have it. Apparently I excelled at masochism after 25 years in employment, as well as trying my hand at the sadistic domination of hundreds of employees over the years in various management positions. Strange that I didn't find the whole thing a bit more exciting. It certainly sounds quite a bit more thrilling when analyzed this way. On the other hand, I can certainly identify with the enmeshed, dependent, and complicated relationships that form between boss and employee. I don't remember ever fearing that the people who worked for me would become too independent, but I certainly do remember feeling pressure to appear harsh and uncompromising about performance. I also identify with the need to somehow kiss superiors' wonderful posteriors, yet at the same time trying to avoid appearing to be a spineless lackey. So I have to say that there is an element of truth in what Chancer is saying. I was startled to find the thesis so meticulously proven, and our modern workplace fits so snugly into a pejorative framework. It also struck me as very satisfying to see our often rosy view of work being relentlessly smashed by pointing out that far from being harmless, modern work could be viewed as sadistic torture from one perspective and masochistic sacrifice from another. But Chancer's book also struck me as a bit too neat in its assertions. In my career, most of the people I worked for didn't fit my definition of sadistic, and where they deviated into sadistic behavior, it was usually under moments of extreme stress. I did experience work as often feeling masochistic as I tended to throw myself into work in an attempt to be noticed for my performance and self-sacrificing efforts. But I also worked with many individuals who were far from submissive and able to just do fine without putting much effort at all. So what do you think? Are you an abused underling in the office busy trying to please a sadistic boss? Or are you a boss who enjoys exercising your power? Or does it all seem a bit of a ridiculous over-dramatization? Either way, please tune in to part 2 of this topic. I will outline my own thoughts on this theory in a bit more detail. I do feel that this topic needs some additional thought. It's too well outlined to dismiss, and if true, it has serious consequences for our mental health. I will throw a link to part 2 above. Thanks for watching. This is XCG reminding you about the subscribe and like buttons below, and as always, wishing you rapid progress on your journey to freedom.